Hello everyone, Jeff Jerome here for segment 2 of the Edgar Allan Poe Birthday Celebration. And you're going to love this segment. This is something totally different from we've done in the past, and you're going to love it. With me is Mr. John Spitzer. John?
Good to see you, Jeff, always.
Glad you could join us. Some of you may remember John from the various Poe birthday celebrations that we've done throughout the years. I remember you did the facts in the case of Valdemar on the stage.
Yes.
And you actually had the actor melt, decompose, and rot right on the stage. Remember that?
As best we could.
Yes. Well, the audience loved it. I mean, there were people going, "Oh my God, he's melting!" You know, it was just fantastic.
Good.
But
yeah, we never mind. I won't even tell you the rehearsals for the mask. Okay, there we go.
Also, the 2009 funeral for Poe that he never had. Yeah. You may remember John as Rufus Griswold. Okay, and you were just fantastic in that.
Thank you.
Everything you do is fantastic. So instead of listening to me talk, why don't you tell the audience, because they want to know things about you, like how did you first become interested in Poe? At what age?
Well, let's see. I guess I would have been about 9 years old. I would have been in 3rd grade. And we read The Cask of Amontillado, of course. And the lesson plan was all about irony. And the question was, so what's ironic about this story? Well, John here is the only hand in the air going, let's just start with the name Fortunato. And then let's go to Montresor's concern over Fortunato's health. And from there, it was as if I had found a kindred spirit. I loved the use of language. Just his choice of words. The period language really captured me, I think. And I think Poe's ability to stack word upon word upon word upon word in this sort of, it just builds right to the climax, what we would call singularity of effect.
Well, it's interesting that you became attracted to Poe through that story, because most people will say, oh, I was in the 5th grade, Telltale Heart, The Black Cat. Those two stories seem to be what grabs people, but they didn't. Another story grabbed you.
Yeah.
That's really fantastic. So for me, it was The Telltale Heart, I have to admit. And I was, how old was I? 10, I think, something like that.
9, 10.
And of course, I grew up with the Vincent Price, Roger Corman films. Mm-hmm. And after that, I was just totally hooked on Poe. Yeah. And here I am today, former curator of the Poe House, So tell us something else about you. You're an actor, director. Tell people what you do.
What do you do? The accepted blurb is I am a professionally produced and published playwright. I think I like writing and directing probably the best. Like most people, I started as a performer, but I really preferred shaping things as a director, writing things, still that literary bent, that love for words, which, I think is a great deal of my kinship with Eddie. Mm-hmm. I've been doing it for, it's around 4 decades now. Okay. In all aspects of theater and in all styles, from period through naturalism through postmodernism. In fact, my theater company that I ran for 20 years in Washington concentrated solely on early 20th century avant-garde work, which we called our History of Para Theater, and also postmodernist theater, which was our Hanke work series.
Well, it's funny you keep mentioning words, and what surprised me at a young age was that Poe invented words. And if he was writing a story and he got stuck for a word, it was like he just couldn't, he would make one up.
Yes.
And I think that's one reason why some young people have some difficulty reading Poe, because they find these words and they don't know what it means. Mm-hmm. And I always tell them to have a dictionary right there. Yeah. But don't be surprised if you don't find a definition of that word.
Exactly.
And I think it's amazing. One scholar did a study, and I believe he came up with almost 1,000 words that Poe created. And you can just imagine Poe going, oh, I need a word, gobbledygook. Yeah, that will work. And people say, yeah, it really, it really does work.
It does. And in fact, in this piece, we'll be hearing the word articulo mortis, which sounds very official. Now, I've gone back to the OED and every reference I can find. Poe is the first attribution for that. I think if you know Latin, you can easily figure out what it was. And in Poe's time, you could assume if someone had an education, they knew at least rudimentary Latin and would know that articulo meant in motion, still alive, and yet mortis, dead at the same time.
Yeah. And what's the other word? Physis?
Yes, physis.
Physis.
Yeah, whether the unpronounced P, the silent P. It's also physis or physis. It depends. And that is an advanced form of consumption, which plagued Poe's life. It took his mother when he was 4 years old. Am I correct? As well,
three,
yeah. And his brother and his wife. So yeah, a lot of his stories have to do with consumption or from some unnamed ailment like the Red Death that very closely resembles it. He lived in terror of it, quite frankly, Jeff. Everyone did, but I can't imagine it hitting closer to home than being with your brother at 3 years of age when she rose cold.
Exactly. So keep that dictionary next to your Poe works when you read it.
Absolutely.
Now, something else about Poe, which maybe some of you know, is that even though he didn't finish college because of John Allan, he was very well read. I like to say that his mind was like a sponge. It absorbed everything. And that will come into play with the story that these people will see. That Poe wrote with such perceived knowledge of things that people thought it's true.
Absolutely.
And I remember Maria Clem, after Poe died suddenly, and Rufus Griswold seizing that opportunity to defame him, she said she panicked and burned stacks of letters and newspaper clippings. She was so afraid Griswold would get hold of those things. I know, what a wealth of information. Well, listen.
But you can't blame her. In retrospect.
I mean, she was alone.
And Virginia those works could have provided her a very nice dotage, shall we say.
Yeah.
But no, they were lining the coffers of Mr. Griswold instead.
Exactly. So you're right. You really can't blame her because she was in a panic. And she thought Griswold was actually going to help Poe. No. So it didn't exactly work out.
There are so many mysteries in Poe's life. Of course, the first one is how did he die? And I hope we never solve that because that's just such a fun one. Okay, do you want it in alphabetical, chronological, or in order of importance? I think there's like 72 of them at present.
And every year there's a new one, just as stupid, just as silly as the previous one.
Exactly, because, hey, it sells. Poe sells. Let's face it.
Exactly. Now, before we become mesmerized, do you have any parting words for the audience? Something you want to leave with the audience about Poe?
I think I share with a lot of you the feeling that Poe is very close to my heart and personally very close to me. He certainly was not the psychotic madman we turned him out to be. He's sort of become emblematic for, I think, all of us who are creative, who are outside the norm just a little bit. And that's what was so wonderful about all of the celebrations. Even before I participated, I was there every year. And I was so touched, and moved to tears. Even if we were talking about Poe's glandular conditions, right. I was moved to tears simply by the fact that Eddie was finally getting the recognition he deserved. And was very proud to be part of that. And I think, over the years, we live in very interesting times, and his reputation is being slowly rehabilitated. And I just believe that Poe is definitely the most underrated genius of early American literature and perhaps of all literature.
Oh, I will agree with that. And let me just add to what you just said, that Poe was a good person.
Yeah.
And a very loving husband. People that were friends with Poe were very loyal to him, and it just rubs me the wrong way when people say, oh, Poe had no friends, he was wandering the streets. That's nonsense.
No.
And I think what many people do is they read Poe's stories and they read about the narrators who are deranged and whatever, and they go, well, Poe must have been like that. So, you know, it's like, well, wait a minute, what about his comedies?
Exactly.
What about the science fiction?
Thank you.
The adventure stories?
Thank you.
The poetry, the love poetry that he wrote. Oh, they don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
They want to hear that, oh, he was like Usher in that Fall House of Usher, you know.
He was a necrophiliac.
Yeah,
he had relations with his mother-in-law after she was dead.
Yeah, well, that's what Griswold did. He suggested that. So just,
but no, he was
just
a very...
stop it with that nonsense. Okay?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was a very good family man, a loving husband, generous to his friends, generous when he had nothing to give.
And he was always improving, always reading.
Absolutely.
Always, despite poverty, illness, and all the literary abuse he suffered from his contemporaries. You know, anyone else would have said, I've had it, I'm out of here, I'm going to become a plumber or something.
Exactly.
No, he stuck with it, and he persevered, and he never gave up.
And he was really doing it against the odds and against every social convention of the time. In young America, almost all authors were doctors or lawyers or had some family money behind them. Poe was the first one who was determined to make his living by the pen. And I think that really, I mean, just puts a big kick under what you just said.
Yes, yes, yes.
He persevered through all of that. No, he did not finish his education, but everything he read was, as you say, immediately absorbed by osmosis. And I believe Griswold looked at him and said, what, this southerner with no education? And yet he writes better than I do. Can anybody say Salieri? Okay, thank you.
Well, we could go on for an hour talking about this, but
we've been on for many hours talking about this, Jeff.
Yes. So, are we ready to mesmerize the audience?
I believe that we are.
John?
We and Monsieur Valdemar.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Jeff.
I hope that you're going to become a fixture in this Poe birthday celebration. You're a good guy.
Oh, I'm just delighted to be back in the fold.
Terrific. All righty. Thank you, audience.
Thank you. See you on the other side. Of course, I shall not pretend to consider it any matter for wonder that the extraordinary case of Monsieur Valdemar has excited a discussion. It would have been a miracle had it not, especially under the circumstances. Through the desire of all parties concerned to keep the affair to ourselves, at least for the present, or until we had farther opportunities for investigation, through our endeavors to effect this, a garbled or exaggerated account made its way into society and became the source of many unpleasant misrepresentations and, quite naturally, of a great deal of disbelief. It is now rendered necessary that I give the facts, as far as I comprehend them myself. They are succinctly these. For the past 3 years, my attention has been repeatedly drawn to the subject of mesmerism, and about 9 months ago it occurred to me, quite suddenly, that in the series of experiments performed hitherto, there had been a most remarkable and very unaccountable omission. No person had as yet been mesmerized in articulo mortis. It remained to be seen, first, whether in such condition there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the magnetic influence. Secondly, whether, if any existed, it was impaired or increased by the condition. Thirdly, to what extent or for how long a period the encroachments of death might be arrested by the process. There were other points to be ascertained, but these most excited my curiosity, the last in especial for the immensely important character of its consequences. In looking around me for some subject by whose means I might test these particulars, I was brought to think of my friend, Monsieur Ernst Valdemar, the well-known compiler of the Bibliotheca Forensica and author, under the nom de plume of Issachar Marx, of the Polish versions of Wallenstein and Gargantua. Monsieur Valdemar, who has resided principally at Harlem, New York, since the year 1839, is, or was, particularly noticeable for the extreme spareness of his person, his lower limbs much resembling those of John Randolph, and also for the whiteness of his whiskers, in violent contrast to the blackness of his hair, the latter in consequence being very generally mistaken for a wig. His temperament was markedly nervous, and rendered him a good subject for mesmeric experiment. On 2 or 3 occasions I had put him to sleep with little difficulty, but was disappointed in other results which his peculiar constitution had naturally led me to anticipate. His will was at no period positively or thoroughly under my control, and in regards to clairvoyance I could achieve with him nothing to be relied upon. I always attributed my failure at these points to the disordered state of his health. For some months previous to my becoming acquainted with him, his physicians had declared him in a confirmed phthisis. It was his custom, indeed, to speak calmly of his approaching dissolution, as of a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. When the ideas to which I have alluded first occurred to me, it was, of course, very natural that I should think of Monsieur Valdemar. I knew the steady philosophy of the man too well to apprehend any scruples from him, and he had no family in America who would be likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and to my surprise, his interest seemed vividly excited. I say to my surprise, for although he had always given himself freely to my experiments, he had never before given me any token of sympathy with what I did. His disease was of that character which would admit of exact calculation in respect to the epoch of its termination in death. And it was finally arranged between us that he would send for me about 24 hours before the period announced by his physicians as that of his decease. It is now rather more than 7 months since I received from Monsieur Valdemar himself this subjoined note.
My dear P., you may as well come now. D and F are agreed I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow midnight, and I think they have hit the time very nearly. Valdemar.
I received this note within half an hour after it was written, and in 15 minutes more I was in the dying man's chamber. I had not seen him for 10 days, and was appalled by the fearful alteration the brief interval had wrought in him. His face wore a leaden hue, his eyes were utterly lustreless, and the emaciation was so extreme, the skin had been broken through by the cheekbones. The expectoration was excessive, the pulse was barely perceptible. He retained, nevertheless, in a very remarkable manner, both his mental power and a certain degree of physical strength. He spoke with distinctness, took some palliative medicines without aid, and, when I entered the room, was occupied in penciling memoranda in a pocketbook. He was propped up in bed by pillows. Doctors D and F were in attendance. After pressing Monsieur Valdemar's hand, I took these gentlemen aside and obtained from them a minute account of the patient's condition. The left lung had been for 18 months in a semi-osseous or cartilaginous state, and was, of course, entirely useless for all purposes of vitality. The right, in its upper portion, was also partially, if not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was merely a mass of purulent tubercles running one into another. Several extensive perforations existed, and, at one point, permanent adhesion to the ribs had taken place. These appearances in the right lobe were of comparatively recent date. The ossification had proceeded with very unusual rapidity. No sign of it had been discovered a month before, and the adhesion had only been observed during the past 3 previous days. Independently of the phthisis, the patient was suspected of aneurysm of the aorta, but on this point the osseous symptoms rendered an exact diagnosis impossible. It was the opinion of both physicians that Monsieur Valdemar should die about midnight on the morrow, Sunday. It was then 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. On quitting the invalid's bedside to hold conversation with myself, Doctors D and F had bidden him a final farewell. It had not been their intention to return, but, at my request, they agreed to look in upon the patient about 10 the next night. When they had gone, I spoke freely with Monsieur Valdemar on the subject of his approaching dissolution, as well as, more particularly, of the experiment proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. A male and a female nurse were in attendance, but I did not feel myself altogether at liberty to engage in a task of this character with no more reliable witnesses than these people in the case of any sudden accident. I therefore postponed operations until about 8 the next night, when the arrival of a medical student with whom I had some acquaintance, Mr. Theodore L., relieved me from farther embarrassment. It had been my design originally to wait for the physicians, but I was induced to proceed, first by the urgent entreaties of Monsieur Valdemar, and secondly by my conviction that I had not a moment to lose, as he was evidently sinking fast. Mr. L. was kind enough to accede to my desire that he would take notes of all that occurred, and it is from his memoranda that what I now have to relate is, for the most part, either condensed or copied verbatim. It wanted about 5 minutes of 8 when, taking the patient's hand, I begged him to state as clearly and distinctly as he could to Mr. L. whether he, Monsieur Valdemar, was entirely willing that I should make the experiment of mesmerizing him in his then condition. He replied, feebly yet quite audibly,
"Yes, I wish to be mesmerized. I fear you have deferred too long."
While he spoke thus, I commenced the passes which I had already found most effective in subduing him. He was evidently influenced with the first lateral stroke of my hand across his forehead, but although I exerted all my powers, no further perceptible effect was induced until some minutes after 10 o'clock, when Doctors D and F arrived, according to appointment. I explained to them in a few words what I designed, and as they posed no objections, saying that the patient was already in the death agony, I proceeded without hesitation, exchanging, however, the lateral passes for downward ones, and directing my gaze entirely into the right eye of the sufferer. By this time the pulse was imperceptible, and his breathing was stertorous and at intervals of half a minute. This condition was nearly unaltered for a quarter of an hour. At the expiration of this period, however, a natural, although very deep, sigh escaped the bosom of the dying man, and the stertorous breathing ceased. That is to say, its stertorousness was no longer apparent. The intervals were undiminished. The patient's extremities were of an icy coldness. At 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of the mesmeric influence. The glassy roll of the eye was changed for that expression of uneasy inward examination which is never seen except in cases of sleep-waking, and which it is quite impossible to mistake. With a few rapid lateral passes, I made the lids quiver as in incipient sleep, and with a few more, I closed them altogether. I was not satisfied, however, with this, but continued the manipulations vigorously and with the fullest exertion of the will, until I had completely stiffened the limbs of the slumberer, after placing them in a seemingly easy position. The legs were at full length, the arms were nearly so, and reposed on the bed at a moderate distance from the loins. The head was very slightly elevated. When I had accomplished this, it was fully midnight, and I requested the gentlemen present to examine Monsieur Valdemar's condition. With a few experiments, they admitted him to be in an unusually perfect state of mesmeric trance. The curiosity of both physicians was greatly excited. Dr. D resolved at once to remain with the patient all night, while Dr. F took leave with the promise to return at daybreak. Mr. L and the nurses remained. We left Monsieur Valdemar entirely undisturbed until about 3 o'clock in the morning, when I approached him and found him in precisely the same condition as when Dr. F went away. That is to say, he lay in the same position, the pulse was imperceptible, the breathing was gentle, scarcely noticeable unless through the application of a mirror to the lips, the eyes were closed naturally, and the limbs were as rigid and as cold as marble. Still, the general appearance was certainly not that of death. As I approached Monsieur Valdemar, I made a kind of half-effort to influence his right arm into pursuit of my own as I passed the latter gently to and fro above his person. In such experiments with this patient, I had never perfectly succeeded before, and assuredly I had little thought of succeeding now. But, to my astonishment, his arm very readily, although feebly, followed every direction I assigned it with mine. I determined to hazard a few words of conversation. "Monsieur Valdemar, are you asleep?" He made no answer, but I perceived a tremor about the lips, and was thus induced to repeat the question again and again. At its third repetition, his whole frame was agitated by a very slight shivering, and the eyelids unclosed themselves so far as to display a white line of the eyeball. The lips moved sluggishly, and from between them, in a barely audible whisper, issued the words,
"Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die so."
I here felt the limbs, and found them as rigid as ever. The right arm, as before, obeyed the direction of my hand. I questioned the sleep-waker again. "Do you still feel pain in the breast, Monsieur Valdemar?"
"No pain. I am dying."
I did not think it advisable to disturb him farther just then, and nothing more was said or done until the arrival of Dr. F, who came a little before sunrise, and expressed unbounded astonishment at finding the patient still alive. After feeling his pulse and applying a mirror to the lips, he requested me to speak to the sleep-waker again. "Monsieur Valdemar, do you still sleep?" As before, some minutes elapsed ere a reply was made, and during the interval the dying man seemed to be collecting his energies to speak. At my fourth repetition of the question, he said,
"Yes, still asleep. Dying."
It was now the opinion, or rather the wish of the physicians, that Monsieur Valdemar should be suffered to remain entirely undisturbed in his present, apparently tranquil condition until death should supervene, and this, it was generally agreed, must now take place within a few minutes. I concluded, however, to speak to him once more, and merely repeated my previous question. While I spoke, there came a marked change over the countenance of the sleep-waker. The eyes rolled themselves slowly open, the pupils disappearing upwardly. The skin generally assumed a cadaverous hue, resembling not so much parchment as white paper, and the circular hectic spots, which had hitherto been strongly defined at the center of each cheek, went out at once. I use this expression because the suddenness of their departure put me in mind of nothing so much as the extinguishment of a candle by a puff of the breath. The upper lip, at the same time, writhed itself away from the teeth, which it had previously covered completely, while the lower jaw fell with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth widely extended and disclosing in full view the swollen and blackened tongue. I presume that no member of the party then present had been unaccustomed to deathbed horrors, but so hideous beyond conception was the appearance of Monsieur Valdemar at this moment that there was a general shrinking back from the region of the bed. I now feel I have reached a point of this narrative at which everyone will be startled into positive disbelief. It is my business, however, simply to proceed. There was no longer the faintest sign of vitality in Monsieur Valdemar, and including him to be dead, we were consigning him to the charge of the nurses when a strong, vibratory motion was observable in the tongue. This continued for perhaps a minute. At the expiration of this period, there issued from the distended and motionless jaw a voice, such as it would be madness in me to attempt describing. There are indeed 2 or 3 epithets which might be considered as applicable to it in part. I might say, for example, that the sound was harsh and broken and hollow, but the hideous whole is indescribable for the simple reason that no similar sounds have ever jarred upon the ear of humanity. There are 2 particulars, nevertheless, which I thought then and still think might barely be stated as characteristic of the intonation, as well adapted to convey some idea of his unearthly peculiarity. In the first place, the voice seemed to reach our ears, at least mine, from a vast distance or from some cavern deep within the earth. In the second place, it impressed me, I fear that it will be impossible to make myself comprehended, as gelatinous or glutinous matters impressed the sense of touch. I have spoken both of sound and voice. I mean to say that the sound was one of distinct, of even wonderfully, thrillingly distinct syllabification. Monsieur Valdemar spoke, obviously in reply to the question I had propounded to him a few minutes before. I had asked him, it will be remembered, if he still slept. He now said,
Yes. No. I have been sleeping, and now I am dead.
No person present even affected to deny or repress the unutterable, shuddering horror which these few words, thus uttered, were so well calculated to convey. Mr. L., the student, swooned. The nurses immediately left the chamber and could not be induced to return. My own impressions I would not pretend to consider intelligible to the reader. We busied ourselves silently, without the utterance of a word, in endeavors to revive Mr. L. When he came to himself, we addressed ourselves again to an investigation of Monsieur Valdemar's condition. It remained in all aspects as I have last described it, with the exception that the mirror no longer afforded evidence of respiration. An attempt to draw blood from the arm failed. I should mention, too, that this limb was no longer subject to my will. I endeavored in vain to make it follow the direction of my hand. The only real indication, indeed, of the mesmeric influence was now found in the vibratory movement of the tongue whenever I addressed Monsieur Valdemar a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but had no longer sufficient volition. To queries put to him by any person other than myself, he seemed utterly insensible, although I endeavored to place each member of the company in mesmeric rapport with him. I believe I have now related all that is necessary to an understanding of the sleepwaker's state at this epoch. Other nurses were procured, and at 10 o'clock I left the house with the 2 physicians and Mr. L. In the afternoon we all called again to see the patient. His condition remained precisely the same. We had now some discussion as to the propriety and feasibility of awakening him, but we had little difficulty in agreeing that no good purpose would be served by so doing. It was evident that so far death, or what is generally termed death, had been arrested by the mesmeric process. It seemed clear to us all that to awaken Monsieur Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant, or at least his speedy, dissolution. From this period to the close of last week, an interval of 7 months, we continued to make daily calls at Monsieur Valdemar's house, accompanied now and then by medical and other friends. All this time the sleepwaker remained exactly as I had last described him. The nurse's attentions were continual. It was on Friday last that we finally resolved to make the experiment of awakening, or attempting to awaken him. And it is perhaps the unfortunate result of this latter experiment which has given rise to so much discussion in private circles, to so much of what I cannot help thinking unwarranted popular feeling. For the purpose of relieving Monsieur Valdemar from the mesmeric trance, I made use of the customary passes. These, for a time, were unsuccessful. The first indication of revival was afforded by a partial descent of the iris. It was observed as especially remarkable that this lowering of the pupil was accompanied by the profuse outflowing of a yellowish ichor from beneath the lids of a highly pungent and offensive odor. It was now suggested that I should attempt to influence the patient's arm as heretofore. I made the attempt and failed. Dr. F. then intimated a desire to have me put a question. Monsieur Valdemar, can you explain to us what are your feelings or wishes now? There was an instant return of the hectic circles on the cheeks. The tongue quivered, or rather rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained rigid as before. And at length, the same hideous voice, as I have already described, broke forth.
For God's sake, quick, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, waken me, quick. I say to you that I am dead, dead, dead. I was thoroughly unnerved and for an instant remained undecided what to do. At first, I made an endeavor to recompose the patient, but failing in this through total abeyance of the will, I retraced my steps and as earnestly struggled to awaken him. In this attempt, I soon saw that I should be successful, or at least I soon fancied my success would be complete, and I am sure that all in the room were prepared to see the patient awaken. For what really occurred, however, it is quite impossible that any human being could have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passes amid outbursts of dead, 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 absolutely bursting from the tongue and not the lips of the sufferer, his whole frame at once, within the space of a single minute or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. Upon the bed, before that whole company, there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putridity.